Okay, thanks for coming today. So rather than introducing everyone, I will introduce them all these other people, these strange people when I get to them. These are all people who have survived a biochemistry degree and moved on and successfully done something with their lives, or at least done something with their lives. We shall see if it's successful in a minute. So if I share screen, here we go. And move things out of the way so I can actually share screen properly. Okay, so welcome to today's webinar. Let's move that there. So the point of today is to talk about biochemistry as a subject and also biochemistry degrees and the things that you can do with them, the sort of end careers that they tend to lend themselves to, and opportunities that you can then use during your degree to help you get into those career points. It's always useful to think about what you want to do with your degree. And part of that is really you won't achieve until you start doing it. Lots of people think they enjoy labs and then they do some labs and realize they don't quite enjoy labs as much as they thought they did. But they'll always find other things that will enjoy about the experience. And it's a matter of finding the things that you enjoy about their subject and the work life that comes with that to sort of define how you want to use that in the future, really. So what we're going to cover really today is basically, I want to discuss really what I think biochemistry entails, what it encompasses, and how it relates to other fields to some extent. I want to talk what we do in terms of biochemistry at Swansea. So both how we teach biochemistry and what we teach, but also how we interact within research groups and how the biochemical research we do here crosses over to the teaching we undertake. We're going to talk then about sort of the different career routes you can take with that and how the degree hopefully can help you obtain some of those sort of career opportunities. And then we'll come back to these other people, or I'll stop sharing so they can talk about how they use their degree to get where they currently are. And if you've got any questions, we can try and answer them. So that's the general ethos of the day. So moving on swiftly. The hope really, therefore, is basically people who attend this can find out what biochemistry is and whether it's something they're interested in doing. You know, we don't offer, or biochemistry isn't offered as an A-level subject. So it's really what biochemistry is in relation to how it compares to biology, how it compares to chemistry, and what elements it encompasses and which elements it basically avoids from those subjects, to see if that's really what interests you in the current subjects you're taking or what you've done in the past. I say, we want to hear from these other current ex-students about what they've done with the degree and what they found useful and where they've decided to take it as a future career prospect. So, and find out how a biochemistry degree to help you get there. Actually, there's a chat function which allows you to ask questions, and there's a Q&A, so that allows you to add questions into the process, and we can try and answer some of those at the end, and my colleagues here can hopefully address some of the things that I don't know. So first things first is really, what does biochemistry entail? And how does biochemistry differ from biology and chemistry, really? So biochemistry really focuses on, by definition, the chemical processes that occur but in a living organism system. So it's, by definition, it's still the chemical element, it's still the chemical processes that occur, because the chemistry part of biochemistry defines that you have to think of things as chemicals. But think of them in terms of chemicals that relate to each other within a cellular system, within a blood sample, within an organism, and how those molecules and chemicals arrange themselves, interact, and allow that organism to do, or that cell to do what it needs to do at the molecular level. So, and also how cells communicate to each other. So beyond the intracellular element of what biochemistry might encompass, we also look at how cells and organs communicate and sort of interact with each other, both at the small molecule level, protein level, but also how DNA can be adapted to do different things and express different processes. So it's the control mechanisms of cells to some extent. It fits into a wide range of things that cross over to genetics quite a bit as well, and we offer genetics at Swansea as well. I always think of it in this way. So effectively, the genome or genetics basically considers itself mainly with DNA. And DNA in a cell represents what a cell can produce, what it can do. The genome represents the capacity of that cell to do things because it creates those genes and converts them into proteins. The transcriptome, the RNA that derives from that DNA, tells you what parts of those genomes are being transcribed. And so therefore, what elements of that genome are being used at that particular time by those cells. And the transcriptome starts arriving into this area of biochemistry, I would say, because the transcriptome can be adapted at the cellular level by biochemical processes. So chemically, RNA can be altered so that it doesn't turn into proteins or more efficiently turns into proteins. And that's a biochemical process. So anything from beyond the transcriptome really covers biochemistry. So the RNA is obviously translated to proteins. So you get the proteome level activity of a cell. And that's a fundamental core area of biochemistry, is what proteins are doing what, which proteins are holding the cytoskeletal structure together, what proteins are carrying out the enzymatic activity, which is essential for that cell to exist and function, what cells are being moved around the cell and anchored to different places, and how is that anchoring being accommodated. And that's all biochemistry in a traditional sense. And of course, those proteins, mostly the enzymes, create metabolites. They change sugars into amino acids. They make nucleotides. They'll make lipids and make lipids into membranes and vesicles. And that arrangement of molecules in the cell, again, is covered by biochemistry. So it's these latter two parts mainly, that once you get to the protein level, the functional element of genetics, you understand what's happening in biochemistry, because the biochemistry relates to the things, the proteins and the metabolites, which really generate the phenotype of that cell and define what that cell is doing, how it's existing, how rapidly it's proliferating, and whether it's functioning normally or whether it is disordered in some way. So in Swansea, we cover a lot of biochemical research, and from a research perspective, the biochemistry we do follows into four main things we research in Swansea. One area of research at Swansea is biomarkers and genes. So genes predominantly partly falls under the genetics remit, but to some extent also covers biochemistry, in that there's an epigenetic process of regulating gene transcription at the biochemical level. And that's studied by biochemical functions and biochemical scientists. We also have things like biomarkers. So what metabolites and proteins are dysregulated in cancer cells, and how can we understand what that means for the cell? But also, how can we use those biochemical changes diagnostically to predict patient outcomes is also sort of a field we're currently proactive in Swansea. We're also interested in Swansea at the more chemical end of the biochemistry spectrum and developing medical devices. So developing chemical methods of detecting these biomarkers and small molecules at very low levels to try and develop new point of care devices based on techniques that we'd commonly use in chemistry. So one of these things is FTIR, infrared spectroscopy, which is generally a chemical technique. It's used for analyzing synthetic chemicals you produce in the lab, but we can use it to study sputum samples, serum samples, and use it as a diagnostic point of care device to diagnose patients and their outcomes. And so taking traditional chemical analysis techniques and applying them to biochemical and biomedical settings is one of the areas of interest within the actual research at Swansea. Another main area is immunology and microbes and how the immune system functions from a biochemical level. And one of the PhD students will talk probably a lot more about that. And it's Swansea we have another area of health informatics and data science, which is less biochemistry related, but it relates to the patient outcomes of all these other activities. Can you define what the impact on patients is at a population level? So does this impact on actual human patient outcomes, or is it just a theoretical exercise in how a cell responds? So, I say, we teach biochemistry at Swansea, and we teach a number of degrees. You can split into three main groups. Basically, we teach traditional biochemistry, and this was really the first degree that we started here. We teach a medical biochemistry version of that, where the focus is more emphasized upon the medical aspects of biochemistry and disorders that occur when biochemical pathways are dysregulated and don't function in a normal manner. And we also have a joint honours in biochemistry and genetics, because really these days, biochemistry and genetics are really different ends of the same spectrum. So a biochemist needs to appreciate the genetic causes of the proteins that are having their biochemical impact, as much as a geneticist needs to understand the effect of the genetic mutation on the protein level and what that means for the cell. So the joint honours tries to encompass the different strands into one degree. But these are all sort of different focuses within the biochemical arena, effectively. By definition, we have a lot of teaching facilities. So we have teaching labs shown over here, which are sort of generic labs for the purposes of teaching undergraduate practicals. We also have research facilities, which we try and cross over what we do in research to teaching and vice versa. So especially within final year projects, we try and place students within the research labs themselves, so they embed themselves within those research labs and really get to appreciate what it is to undertake lab-based research as a career, effectively, because that gives them a better feel for whether that's something they really want to do in the future. So as I say, briefly, I'll talk through the biochemistry degree, but it wouldn't be surprising to understand that the first year of a biochemistry degree encompasses the generic areas of biology. So it covers biochemistry. We look at energy production pathways and metabolism pathways. You'd cover microbiology and cell biology, but also we need to still function on the chemistry, and mainly the organic chemistry and how functional groups of molecules impart chemical reactivity into those molecules. And alongside as many of the years as we can, we also run a skills development module to try and emphasize the skills that students can develop to embed into their CV and use in future careers. Second year of a degree tends to be more focused, so we'll focus mainly on different types of pathways. So we'll look at advanced metabolism of other molecules other than simple glucose. We'll look at immunology and the biochemical processes behind that, how infections are regulated by biochemical processes, and neuroscience variations of biochemistry. So what proteins and molecules are important in neuronal development and neuroplasticity. But we also cover sort of the techniques, the underlying basics of how you take a sample, a blood sample or a biopsy sample, and generate useful information and meaningful information from that sample, be it the genetic, protein, or metabolite level. In the third year, modules tend to be specialized within research interests. So things like membrane trafficking, which is the mechanism by which cells decide when to break down proteins and how they go about capturing proteins they want to break down and organize that process. Immunopathology, how the immune system dysregulation causes disorders and diseases, and specific metabolism of nucleic acids and how they can be modified and how those pathways can be targeted as drug targets for oncology, pharmaceuticals, and those sorts of things. Another key thing we specifically cover in third year in Swansea is a research-facing module called bioinformatics, which is the idea that these days in research for biochemistry and genetics, experiments can generate a large amount of data very quickly. They can generate thousands of metabolites worth of data, or thousands of genome sequences, or protein architecture displays. And bioinformatics is the mechanism of making sense of those large data sets, because it's too overwhelmed to just put into an Excel spreadsheet and make a conclusion from. You need a whole set of bioinformatic platforms to really tell you what those data sets mean. And we teach you how to take those data sets and draw conclusions from them. A key aspect of the final year project, of course, is the fact you do a final year research degree, and this is. It's one thing this is useful because we've diversified what we offer as projects, and we try to offer a diversity of projects to reflect the fact that some students don't particularly want to do research labs or be as a researcher in labs as their future career. So we try and offer a diversity of projects so people can try and tailor their projects as much as possible to what they eventually want to do with their life and career. Traditionally, it's always been lab-based projects. And the idea of any of these projects is you get embedded within a research group, an active research group, so that you get a feel for what it's like to work alongside PhDs and postdoctoral staff, and work within that group to generate data towards a collective research finding. And that helps you understand whether you want to do that as a PhD or work on to other parts of other career paths. Another important thing we do in Swansea is we offer 2 types of degree. So any of these degrees you can take as a BSc, which we've discussed as a traditional 3-year degree, or you can take as a 4-year MSci option. The point of the MSci really is to try and increase students' research understanding and also enhance their CV for applying for future research opportunities, mainly PhDs. So in the MSci version of the degrees, you do the first 2 years the same as normal students, but you don't do a 3rd-year project. You take a specialist lab techniques training course where you rotate around different labs and different techniques. So you become a specialist in a wide range of techniques. And then in the 4th year, you spend pretty much the whole year doing an advanced research project, again with the research group lab groups. So you spend the whole academic year just doing the research project and producing a thesis and having a viva at the end of it. And it tunes you into getting into that PhD opportunity and helps you appreciate what that PhD would be like. So the important thing really is to think about things that you might want to do with your degree. It seems a bit odd when you're thinking about studying for a degree to think about what's going to come after that, because that's 3 or 4 years away. But it's useful to think about what a degree can offer you in terms of opportunities of where it can take you. And traditionally, biochemistry has lent itself very easily to the idea of studying and going into research. By definition, biochemical research then lends itself to PhD opportunities, but also working in industrial research and development. And also, you can go from research into academic teaching. We'll discuss that as a route in a second. More recently, students have taken their biochemistry degree, and especially the medical biochemistry degree, and gone into healthcare roles. So physician associate in medicine as a future career path. Beyond that, there are clinical placements or clinical opportunities in labs in the NHS, so as a biomedical scientist or as an NHS lab specialist. And often students feel they want to go into teaching, and we try to alter what we do in the degree to offer opportunities to develop that as a skill set within the degree as well. So we'll go through these one at a time, and as we come to them, we'll talk to students who have gone through these processes, and I'll let them talk rather than me witter on endlessly. So people need to think about when you get to how you get to a PhD, and there are various routes to a PhD. By far the simplest is you do a BSc, you do an undergraduate degree, and you graduate from that degree, and then you apply for PhDs. And applying for a PhD is different from applying for UCAS for a course at a university. You effectively look for PhD adverts, and you individually apply to the academic who's running that PhD to be considered for that particular PhD. And it usually involves an interview with the PhD supervisor. And if you're successful, you get awarded the PhD, and it comes with a stipend usually of around about £15,000 a year living grant. And you spend 3 years doing research that you write up as a thesis. We've developed the MSci as a mechanism of trying to improve students' competitiveness in getting these PhDs. Because it's an interview process, the more skill sets you have on your CV and the more you've done, the more attractive you look as a PhD applicant. And so the MSci's main purpose is to try and make students more competitive at obtaining those PhD positions. Some students do a biochemistry degree, and biochemistry is quite a wide field, but they want to work, say, in neuroscience or immunology. And they feel that, well, actually, the biochemistry degree, although it has elements of those, is quite broad. And they want to re-emphasize and train themselves up in the field of that neurobiology or immunology before applying for a PhD. So some students do a BSc, but then do a master's course in a particular subject with a view of making themselves more attractive as applicants for a PhD in that subject. So you can do an MSc in neurobiology, and then try and apply for a PhD specifically in that field, because you'll stand out from the applicants for PhDs as having more of a grounding in neurobiology, for example. Alternatively, you can also do a master's, which isn't taught, but is effectively a master's by research, which is similar to the MSci, But again, it's a year separately funded after your BSc, where you get an additional qualification, but again, you get a year's research activity and you build up your skill sets in the lab. And that helps effectively make you attractive as an applicant for a PhD. So hopefully biochemistry should lend itself to applying for PhDs. So within a biochemistry degree, you'll get general lab skills, but also the data handling skills that come alongside that. General lab skills are very good and important, and being able to produce data from a lab is essential. Equally important is handling that data and generating outcomes from it, but also demonstrating what that data means to other people and displaying that data in a meaningful way. And so we try and cover both those aspects within the degree course. Also communicating those ideas to other people, both in terms of scientific writing, because if you're going to do a PhD, you're going to have to write a PhD thesis eventually, but also communicating that so that when you go to conferences, you can talk to people about those findings. And as I say, the final project embeds you in a research group so you get a feel for what it's like to live day by day by a PhD student and see them suffer and drag and work through their lab days and get a feel for whether that's really what you want to do with your life. And before we pass to the students to talk about things, really, you can think of PhD often leading through a career path. So often people will do the degree, the BSc or their MSci, they will do a PhD. Often they'll stay within academia, and once they've completed a PhD, you don't do another PhD, you generally get a postdoctoral research assistant role, so a PDRA role, which is effectively a paid researcher in an academic institution like a university, with the view that some of those, and often you'll do multiple PDRA posts, you'll move around universities, but eventually some of these people will then take up academic posts and then become a tutor or a lecturer and move into the academics arena effectively. So if I stop sharing now, because you've heard, we'll come back to this in a bit. If I go to Sean, who's a current PhD student, who can talk about how much fun he has on a day-by-day basis.
Thanks, Ed. Yeah, I mean, well, PhD, I suppose, is a series of ups and downs, as is any sort of other degree to an extent. But yeah, I really thoroughly enjoy what I do, and I can really strongly recommend it as a pathway if you really are interested in doing research and managing in many ways your own time, your own sort of devotion to specific areas that you find interesting. And if you're very self-determined and can direct your own learning, then it's definitely something that's kind of worthwhile and interesting to have a go at and go into. So a little bit about my background and myself. So I started off doing biochemistry at Swansea for my undergrad, and then straight after that I went into a PhD. So I was quite fortunate. The research group that I did my third year research project with was an immunology group, and I was looking at T cells and the immunometabolic function of those T cells for that research project. And after completing that, that was at the end of third year, they had a PhD position open, and I applied for that and got that position. So it was kind of like a nice easy step in from there. And that's one of the really fantastic things about those third year research projects, is because you are working with actual researchers in those kinds of fields. If it's something that you find you actually really enjoy, it's a topic area that you find interesting, you've already got a good connection with those academics, with the principal investigator, professor, who can then potentially offer you something like a master's or a PhD afterwards, if it's something that you think you would find really interesting, and they think that you've been a good student and you've managed to prove yourself in the lab and prove yourself with your data analysis having capabilities and things like that. So a little bit about a PhD is kind of like one of those black boxes, I guess, as no one really knows what they're getting themselves into until you throw yourself into it. So as Ed mentioned earlier, you actually kind of get some sort of help with it. So they're usually funded, which means you're not getting in any more student debt, which is nice. And you also get the stipend, which means it's basically like a salary. So that makes the student living just a little bit better than than when you're an undergrad. Then, as Ed said as well, it's usually a 3-year for a full-time course. So that's a minimum candidature, but you have a maximum candidature as well. So you have 4 years of time to actually submit your thesis. So usually that 4th year is spent writing up and getting everything sorted for the submission and having a viva, which is how your PhD is assessed at the end. It's kind of like a grilling with a bunch of other experts in the field, and they test and prod and try and tear your thesis apart, and you have to defend it. And that's kind of the general process, and it's a sort of slow build up to that point. As you go through 3 years, you'll have like a practice vivas and like a first year viva and things like that, so that you've got a bit of experience before going into that. And then by the time you come to submit, hopefully you should be the expert in that particular niche field, and it will be a good experience. And then you can go on to do all sorts of other things. There's so many transferable skills you get from doing a PhD. It's not just research all the time. There's a lot of sort of management aspects to it as well, and lots of people go off into other sorts of things like product development, or sometimes going off into like sales for different like biotech companies, things like that, as well as going into academia. So there's plenty of options to look at for even after the PhD. All right, I'll hand back to you, Ed.
Cool. Okay, so Sean's partway through his PhD. Mike survived a PhD and then didn't run away fast enough.
I didn't know. I stayed.
So you fairly finished PhD, but now you're currently on a large-scale grant?
Yeah, so my time is split between 2 European projects. So when I did biochem, I did the taught masters for nanomedicine, and that kind of introduced me to the whole nanomaterials and toxicology world. And after I did a small research project at the end of that, I stayed for a PhD in the same group. And that was, again, just genetic toxicology of nanomaterials. And then when that came to an end, there was a postdoc, which is along the lines of risk governance to do with nanomaterials and toxicology testing, developing new operating protocols that need to be developed for the use of nanomaterials and not just chemicals, reducing animal testing by making advanced in vitro models, so developing multiple cultures for like the lung, for example, rather than doing animal exposures in the lung. And the other project I'm split on then is called nanoinformatics, and that's more to do with diving into data that's already been published and trying to repurpose that. So, for example, we're trying to write a paper at the moment which is plucking out the characterization data for carbon nanotubes and then trying to plug that data into in silico models to predict nanotube pathogenicity, so you can create safe by design nanomaterials in the future.
Cool. Sounds fun. Okay, and then finally, April basically did both of these things and then decided to join academia.
Yeah, I'm still not sure what I've gotten myself into, really. So if I talk briefly about like my journey to where I've got here. So I did biochemistry degree at Swansea Uni. And then I ended up, so I really enjoyed my research project in 3rd year. And I really wanted to stay and do research. So my experience is a little bit different because I ended up doing a master's first of all, because there was no funding available. So I got student finance for the funding. But then my supervisor actually managed to find funding for my final 2 years. So the first year of the master's my master's ended up being the first year of my PhD. It got switched into that. And then last year was meant to be start my 4th year of the PhD, and I ran out of funding, and I managed to get a research assistant role instead while I completed the PhD. So the research assistant role, I've been looking at like COVID samples and seeing if we can repurpose some drugs so that we can target COVID therapy. And then from that, the role popped up for biochemistry tutor a few months ago, which is basically like the stepping stone into academia. So now I'm starting to give lectures, do some of the practical sessions, and I've got some tutees that I'm looking after. And I'm also doing research on the side. So things that have like really helped me get to this point. It's going dark in here now. So in my undergrad, I was a student rep. So that really helped me get to know what was going on in the background of the teaching staff. So like attending boards of studies where you can see how the lecturers are trying to work out what the best way to teach students is and the best way to help them. And then during the PhD as well, you have lots of opportunities to do some teaching. So you get some opportunities to do some lecturing, and you get some opportunities to be some demonstrators, so helping out in the practical sessions with all the students. So there's a couple of other things like in the background that I've done to sort of help me get to this position and really enforced what I like. So I've loved the research, and I've also loved the teaching elements. So helping students get their degree in the end, it's really nice seeing like the light bulb moments with students and seeing that they are appreciating your help, sort of thing. So that's how I am where I am, and I'm enjoying it so far.
Fair enough. Okay, cool. So if we go back to the PowerPoints, which is going to be a bit of swing and throwing. So that covers research really from an academic standpoint. So within academia, so within university settings. Another option many people go towards is sort of healthcare roles. So directly from their degree, they can apply through various means to become a physician's associate, which is a relatively new role within the NHS, or study medicine. And if you want to study graduate entry medicine, you complete your BSc, you graduate, and then you effectively go back into the UCAS application process, and you do whatever entry examination is required for that particular medical school that you want to apply for, and you apply for UCAS for graduate entry medicine. Alternatively, if you want to study things like or become a physician associate, then after graduating again from your degree, you have a direct application to the universities, because the physician associate is usually run as a master's course, and therefore it's a direct application to that university rather than an application through UCAS. And you can apply to as many universities as you wish to some extent. Now, within the course Swansea Biochemistry, medical biochemistry and medical genetics act as some of these pathways to medicine. And what this really means is we have a second year module which is effectively run by clinical staff. It's run by clinicians with the aim of getting students to appreciate what it is that makes a good doctor, makes a good medicine student, and what skill sets beyond just understanding the biochemical defects that cause disease, people and doctors need to appreciate to successfully apply themselves to the healthcare field. And with the view that they will become better applicants and apply to our graduate entry medicine course at Swansea. So to that end, we also have, if I stop sharing here, if we start with Kirsty, we have Kirsty who's currently on, well, 6 or 7 weeks into a physician's associate course at Swansea.
Hi.
Hello.
So my journey, I did a medical biochemistry degree in Swansea. I always knew sort of laboratory work wasn't for me, but I absolutely loved science in school, so I needed to go down sort of the biochem route because that was my favourite topics. So I actually went into the world of work. So I worked in the Welsh Blood Service as a medical laboratory assistant, and they were actually going to pay for me to be able to become a biomedical scientist. So I was going to go down the route of working sort of as a BMS. But then I've always wanted a more clinical role, so I applied for the physician associate degree and got in. So it's a 2 years master's program. The physician associate, for those that are not aware, is a medical generalist. So whilst not a doctor, they work within the medical model. So you can work in various settings, surgical, GP practices, you can work clinical. So we're there to work, diagnose and manage patients, basically. what else can I say?
How much of the course is taught versus placement for the physician associate? I don't.
So it's very heavily placement based. So at the
Okay.
moment we're in clinics Wednesdays and Fridays at the moment with COVID. So the majority of lectures are currently online, but we are sort of in clinics practicing, doing history taking quite early on, to be honest. We're in the majority of clinics in year 2. So in year 1, we get 7 days of being placed into GP practices, where we can learn like quite early on to have that patient facing sort of learning on how to deal with different sort of conditions, etc. But yeah, I'd highly recommend Swansea as a university overall, because I find the teaching there is very, you can go to them for help at any time and they're always willing to always help you. So going from sort of my degree, I did go out of education, but I wanted so badly to come back because Swansea was always there for me, and I wouldn't have gone to a different university other than Swansea for me.
Okay, so Chris is currently on physician associate. Ross, on the other hand, made the dreadful mistake of studying medicine.
Yes, I did. So I did medical biochemistry in Swansea, and I studied at the same time as a couple of other people on the screen. So there's quite a few people here that actually I already know a little bit, and that's a little bit like Swansea generally. You know, it is a little bit like a family, because you sort of get to know everyone, you know, all around, and you see a lot of familiar faces. So I definitely recognise that in what Kirsty was just saying. I thoroughly enjoyed my biochemistry degree. I chose to do medical biochemistry because, well, the biochemistry was the bit that I enjoyed most at A-level, really, the biology side of chemistry and the chemistry side of biology. I didn't really know what I wanted to do once I graduated, and I changed my mind an awful lot. And as you begin to see, there's a lot of different prospects out there for you, because there's a lot of really great skills you develop. For me in medicine, one of the things I found is that the biomedical knowledge, the biochemical knowledge I had that I could apply in the biomedical setting gave me a really good firm grounding for sort of all of the pathology that's encountered when trying to learn about sort of disease. And I became quite adept at dealing with complexity. So if you've done any sort of Google search of any biochemical pathway, you'll see it can look quite horrible from time to time at first glance. But during the course, you develop skills and you know how to sort of methodically move through it and not be afraid of complexity. And that's something that's really helped me an awful lot going forward now to do graduate entry medicine in Swansea still. And added to that is the critical thinking that you develop, you begin to develop as you do the course and as you go through it, through the various courseworks and assessments. And that's quite handy because although I'm not like anyone pursuing research, I'm not at the forefront of trying to learn more about sort of diseases or how we manage them. I have to still be able to deal with a wide breadth of basic information about how a lot of different diseases function. And I have to be able to critically evaluate what I think is the best way of managing them there and then. And sometimes that's looking at guidelines, and other times that's relying upon, okay, well, I've got a bit of data. It says that this drug is good. Do I believe that or not? And so actually, you know, I've really, really enjoyed my time at Swansea so far. 6 years I've been here so far on the trot. And yeah, my biochemistry degree gave me a really good basis from which, you know, I use information that I learned from that degree and skills that I developed. I use them every day that I study here. And I will use those skills every day as I go forward to work in my eventual career too.
Okay, cool. Thank you very much. Okay, so far we've really focused on research within higher education and further study in the sort of healthcare fields. Of course, some people, as I like to say, go out and get proper jobs. And a lot of these, again, are available in the sort of research area and research sort of research and development sort of field within companies. To that end, we have two here. So we have Becky and Alice. So effectively, Becky, if we start with you, I guess you've effectively gone from a biochemistry degree and then sort of moved into the research aspect of career effectively?
Yeah, so I graduated my biochemistry degree last year, and that wasn't a popular decision with most of my year group with COVID. Everyone was quite scared of the world of work and whether you're going to get a job. But to be honest, I think the degree at Swansea equips you really well for getting a job. So from talking to multiple people, when they're in their third year project, it's not very hands-on. When I talk to my colleagues, etc. Whereas at Swansea, it's very, very hands-on. So you get loads of lab experience, which is essential to getting a job in like the real world, when you don't want to stay as a student. So I'm currently working as an associate scientist at a cancer immunotherapy company, and I use the knowledge that I learn in my degree almost every single day. I don't think I could have done this job I wouldn't even been able to get an interview for this job without the degree. So yeah, I don't really have much more to say than that.
So Alice sort of started off after graduating by going into labs.
Yeah, so I graduated from Swansea quite a while ago now, 2014, and I stayed, well, with a lot of help from Ed. I stayed at Swansea then to do a master's by research, again, a lot of help from Ed. Did that in analytical chemistry and immunology, which was because it's through research based in the lab full time. After completing my master's, then I stepped away from education and was able to secure a job in a lab at somewhere called PCI Pharmaceuticals Services. So PCI is a contract manufacturing facility, and we specialise in handling high potent solid oral dose medicines. So we work with clients sort of based across the globe, and we support them in developing, manufacturing, packaging and testing drugs for clinical use. And the end goal then obviously being that we obtain approval from the relevant authority for commercial use of those particular drugs. So as Ed said, as soon as I finished my master's, I started in the lab, and after an 18-month stint they decided that really wasn't for me. So I made a transition within the same company to project management. And I've been lucky over the last few years to work with managing really sort of technically complex projects for some of the biggest pharma companies across the globe. And more recently, I've been promoted to the head of new product introduction. So it's essentially my responsibility to ensure sort of a seamless onboarding of any new molecules that we're working on, and then setting them for success then as they move through sort of their research, their development phases and their clinical research. So my role is really varied, but the degree really gives me sort of a solid foundation to build upon. So it allows me to piece together sort of how the analytical part ties into the sort of drug product development and manufacturing processes. And I say that quite honestly in that I work with other project managers within my department now who don't have that background and actually struggle to sort of add the pieces together. So it really is quite useful, and like I said, hopefully set me up for success.
Cool. Okay, thanks very much. And I guess the key to this is that, you know, a good degree, be it in biochemistry or anything else, shouldn't ever restrict students to one focus. You know, biochemistry by definition risks being a focus on research, and it is to a large part, but it should also allow for students who go through this process, do a degree in biochemistry, who decide that working in a lab, pipetting stuff between tubes isn't the life for them for the entire future, and they want to move into areas where they can manage complex projects and see the overarching impact of that lab experimentation across a sort of a theme effectively. If I quickly go back to the PowerPoint, because it will steal my general wandering meanders. One area that you can also go into, which is lab-based again, is an area of biomedical science and sort of NHS clinical specialist staff. And so biochemical science and biomedical science is really the area of working in NHS labs and doing the diagnostic and genetic and screening tests within the NHS, within the NHS structure, to provide diagnostic values for the medics and to help patient outcomes. And, you know, as the Biomedical Science Society states, 70% of all diagnoses come from those laboratory project outcomes, those laboratory services. So as well as doctors, is actually those lab-based outcomes that are defined by biomedical scientists that generate the actual outcome for the patient to a large extent and help inform that patient's sort of treatment. Now, generally routes to biomedical scientists, you can do undergraduate courses in biomedical sciences. You need to ensure if you do that, that the biomedical science course is accredited by the IBMS, because that makes you accredited biomedical scientist when you graduate. Alternatively, what you can do is you can study a BSc in medical biochemistry or biochemistry genetics, and that will give you a lot of the material you need to be accredited as a biomedical scientist from a talk perspective. Often once you graduate, you don't have the complete set because we don't teach things like transfusions, blood transfusion services and those sorts of things within biochemistry. But in order to become an accredited biomedical scientist in terms of the taught elements, you only need really 4 or 5 additional top-up modules, which are available from quite a few institutions that you can study online. And because they're individual modules rather than whole degrees, they don't cost huge amounts. And then you have all the taught materials to be accredited as a biomedical scientist. Alternatively, recently we've started a master's course in biomedical science at Swansea. You can graduate from the BSc and do a master's course, which we hope to have fully accredited by the IBMS. So the master's course gives you the accreditation as part of that process. Both of these aspects really only give you accreditation for the taught aspects. To be a fully fledged accredited biomedical scientist, what usually happens is you also have to produce a lab work portfolio. And often that is done in NHS lab, produced in labs once you're working in an NHS environment. So you work in the NHS labs and you work for a year generating that portfolio whilst getting paid. And that completes that accreditation process. And once after completing that, you're fully accredited biomedical scientists. And then there's a career pathway through the NHS for those staff. I say we've just started a postgraduate taught biomedical science degree here, which is a 1-year degree that allows you to hopefully get that accredited process. We're seeking accreditation early next year. And within that, there are 3 strands. We've currently got clinical biochemistry as a strand and clinical microbiology, but we're also hoping to start cellular pathology in January. And so you can take which individual specialization within biomedical scientists best suits your interest. Oops. So if I stop sharing there and hand over swiftly to someone who's gone through this process in some way or other, and this is Sophie. So Sophie, good day, how are you? I don't know if you want to talk about where you came from and how you got to where you are and what you currently do.
Yeah, so currently I'm in the NHS as a genetic technologist, which is essentially the genetic version of a biomed. So I did biochemistry and genetics and I graduated in 2017. And then I didn't go straight to the NHS, I went into industry. So I worked for about 2.5 years in an R&D biotech lab, which is really interesting. But I sort of wanted to move towards an NHS role. And then I found out about the role of a genetic technologist. So I've been here for, I think, 1.5 years now. Started during the peak of COVID, which wasn't the best idea, but it's been really interesting. So my role, you can either be in the lab or you can be sort of an office space. My role is sort of kind of in between. So we work with clinical scientists and counselors and all sorts of various doctors and stuff to help diagnose patients with inherited conditions or cancer, stuff like that. And you can also be involved in sort of small little research projects to develop new tests, which is pretty interesting. And then I thought apparently that wasn't enough work, so now I'm back in Swansea and I'm doing a part-time master's in genomic medicine. And my first week this week, and it's been really good so far. So yeah, I definitely recommend going to Swansea.
Cool. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so if I share screen again seamlessly, if I can, let's go from there. So finally then, I just want to say, some students eventually decide after a BSc they want to go into teaching as well. And so Another thing we do in the final year of the degree, the third year, is this research project that you do in the final year doesn't have to be a lab-based project. It can be based on data science, it can be based on clinical data, it can be based on systematic reviews of existing healthcare literature or research-based literature. But one option we provide for students is to do an education-based project, and we refer to it as a teaching science project. And this allows students to effectively develop educational workshops or interventions for either primary or secondary school, FE colleges, or higher education universities themselves, with the view of basically getting both workshops in how to think about education, how to do planning for lessons, and those skill sets that are derived from educational experiences. Physically do a placement so you get face-to-face interaction with a teaching intervention, but also linking that to a research question and thinking about how to develop teaching practices that help students learn or children become enthusiastic about science, or students to think about science careers as a future goal for them. And that's been very successful in terms of helping students think about teaching as a career in various guises, and lends itself to then very easily successfully applying for PGCEs and eventual teaching posts. And the idea of the project, the idea of the diversification of the project is to try and capture as many different end career roles as possible within that project, so that students who feel that that's where they want to go can have something on their CV that makes them stand out when they apply for jobs and apply for those PGC courses and apply for those research in R&D positions and biomedical science positions. So it's part of that tailoring of the degree to best get students to best get what they want from that degree. So I think that's pretty much all I have to say. Are there any questions?